Welcome to Good History, the podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma State University History Department and inspired by the esteemed historian and Oklahoma native Dr. John Hope Franklin's line that a good historian is a moralist at heart. We bring together people from diverse walks of life who research history, studied history, read history, and think about history. We want to know what history means to them, and we want to ask them a big question. If studying history doesn't necessarily make us feel good, how does knowing more of it make our lives better?
Hello, I'm Merle Eisenberg, Assistant Professor in the Oklahoma State University History Department, and I'm honored to be your host for this episode featuring a conversation with Rhys Gay. It's a lot of fun for me to be host on someone else's podcast since I run my own entitled Infectious Historians. My guest today, Rhys Gay. Rhys is also a class of 2009 graduate of the OSU History Department and has, I think it's fair to say, a deep love for OSU, which is most obviously reflected in his role as the 75th Pistol Pete. That is, for all of you who are not OSU fans, the OSU mascot, and this took place during his last year at OSU. And in his spare time from his dynamic career, Rhys has also been a strong advocate in his community for education, healthcare, and access for all types of services for all Oklahomans. Both his career and his advocacy work are really amazing, and I think we'll talk about both of them today. Why I was really excited to have Rhys on was also to discuss how his time as a history major has helped shape how he does both of these aspects of his life. On the surface, neither his career nor his advocacy work appears to have much to do with quote-unquote traditional history learning, as it's thought about in the United States today. But I think Rhys has a lot to share with us about how history, careers, and advocacy are really deeply interconnected. And perhaps even more importantly, how a history major was and continues to be part of his life. But before we get into all of that, I'd just like to say welcome to Good History, Rhys, and good to see you.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
So, as you know, Rhys, I'm a newbie to this state, we might say. And we actually met for the first time, if I remember, when our wives set up a play date at a Touch-a-Truck event for our kids.
That is right, yes.
So you're both born and raised in Oklahoma from our conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Born in Oklahoma City and then lived in the same house in Edmond from time I was born till I moved to Stillwater.
Great. So you're basically still where you vaguely grew up in terms of Edmond?
Yeah. So what's funny is I lived in Edmond and then Stillwater and then moved to Kansas City post-college. And then in 2020 moved back because we have young kids. And so moved back to Edmond. So I've never lived further than 15 miles away from 35 my whole life. I've just gone north and then south.
So I can remember when I got into history, and maybe I'll share mine briefly, and then I'd love to know yours, which is my dad, who's a movie guy, took me to see the Civil War movie Gettysburg, which, as you may know, is 4.5 hours long. And that came out in, I believe, 1993. And I was taken to this film, and there's a moment in it that doesn't make sense logically. And so when I saw this, I had a question. Why did this event happen? And what I then spent the rest of the next 5 or 6 years of my life is trying to understand this missing scene, as it were, in Gettysburg, which it turns out was cut. And if you watch the director's cut, which I did with my son a few months ago, it's actually added in. So if they had released the director's cut, I wouldn't have maybe been a historian, which is an interesting thing.
That's amazing.
But what shaped your interest in history? I mean, how did you get into it?
Yeah, so I think early on my father watched a lot of the World War II movies and that kind of stuff, and I always thought they were kind of interesting. But then I was and my dad was a Vietnam War veteran, and it told me a lot about that. And I've always been one to always pick up on things. I've also always been one to storytell, and have always had kind of a relational brain. Like I always think about this versus that. And that's very much history, right? It's always comparing one set of events to another set of events and correlating both of them together to maybe learn something moving forward. And then I was in 7th grade, and we had actually a student teacher from Oklahoma State at the time was teaching about the American Revolution. And in that, he had made a comment about, well, they were fighting for their own land. They actually, because no one in the class, 7th graders, could understand, like if America was, they're the biggest, strongest country, and he was making the point that like just because you have the biggest, best military, if it's your home turf, you actually have a strategic advantage and all those sorts of things. And I go, oh, like Vietnam? And I'm a 7th grader. I remember the guy turning his head being like, what are you even talking about? and then he followed up with, maybe you should major in history. And like that just kind of sparked a brain in 7th grade. And then between that, and I was in Boy Scouts, and so we did a lot of traveling to camps, and we'd always stop at old, battlefields and different types of things throughout museums. And I always was one to actually stop and read all the facts and like retain the information. And so I think there was always just like this love for understanding the past to really appreciate your present. And that's always kind of stuck with me, both growing up, getting my interest, and then even now professionally. So.
Very cool. And did you arrive then, I guess, at OSU as a history major?
Actually, in secondary education, social studies. So I was like, I'm going to be a history teacher. And that was my whole thing, was teaching history, because I've always had a servant's heart to be able to explain things to people, and I get the most out of growing others. But I got into those classes and realized this is mostly like the actual education stuff, and especially secondary education. That was not what I wanted to do. And especially the classes you take there have nothing to do with history. And in fact, the social studies is actually history, economics, and geography. And I found out from that first semester that I was in love with history, wasn't probably good at it, but I really loved it. Really good at economics from a social science, and I absolutely despised geography and knowing all the facts, figures, like that was just pointless to me. And so after my first semester, I left the College of Education and then came to Arts and Science, where then I started studying history just by happenstance, ended up taking a whole bunch of economic classes because I found them, I was really good at them and found them interesting on the side. And then when I was Pistol Pete, I actually had to stay for an extra year because I was going to graduate in 4.5. So I stayed the extra semester and ended up getting a second major in economics, because at that point all of my electives were all econ, so I had enough to satisfy that as a requirement. So. Nice.
So we'll put Pistol Pete on hold for 1 second. I think we'll return to him.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of the classes you took in history and the professors in particular?
The post-Civil War stuff is really what caught my interest. But what I found, though, is pre-Civil War, actually, I guess it was American history up to 1865 is essentially what it was. And just my ability to recall all of that sort of stuff. There was a Dr. James Cooper that did most of the pre-American history stuff, and so really enjoyed my time with him. And actually, even after I finished coursework with him, we actually built kind of a side friendship. So it was like kind of the first time in my experience of higher education that actually being a friendship with the faculty, right? And I think he's since moved back to Boston to do more of his research on all that kind of stuff. But he probably sticks out most of mine.
Okay, nice. And were there any skills maybe that you pick up that you learned about history?
Well, so everybody always, these day and age, talks about, I did my research. But they don't really know research until you've had to go through hundreds of books, reading intricate details, and then correlating all of those things into a holistic story. And I think that's just paid dividends about not looking things at face value, the ability to actually take the time to sit in a library and know what it means to research, but then also having a perspective, because that's what history is. It's storytelling based on a perspective. And that's how I always talk about, we want to rewrite history. Well, people rewrite history. Victors always write the history. It's because it's always their perspective. And so that was something that was, I think, really codifying, especially as you look into making history, right? Doing things as you progress in your life, that your positioning of that and how that actually works. But I think looking back to understanding and being able to study is something that I'll always take forward with me. The other thing is, I think, the correlation of two sets of facts and being able to articulate it to someone who doesn't know. So it's basically being a history teacher, but in all facets of everything I do. So that's what I found to probably be most helpful, is being able to teach others, because I was able to actually learn on my own. Because I think going from high school to college, if you can learn that core skill set of being able to teach yourself, that's what it's about. And I don't know too many other degrees that actually teach you how to teach yourself. And that's one thing that I think history probably most predominantly gave me.
Yeah, I think that was a nice way of putting it. I'm teaching undergraduate methods course, and I'm trying to teach them these very things, storytelling, perspectives, all these types of things. So now I'll say, I'll use you as my example in class and say this comes from a much wiser person than me, not just your
I
silly
know
professor.
I know you'll get into the professional stuff. I'll definitely tie that back later on. So.
Yeah. So I guess now we need to talk about Pistol Pete.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
What do you mean, oh goodness? This
Oh,
surely
goodness.
is like something people talk to you about all the time, right? So who is Pistol Pete for those listeners who might be less aware?
So Pistol Pete was actually the embodiment of a man named Frank Eaton. So he was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1860. And his parents moved to Kansas after the Missouri Compromise, for all those history buffs, right? But moved out here and then actually through the whole Bleeding Kansas, all that sort of stuff. His parents were actually formerly Jayhawkers, so they were sympathetic to former slaves at that time. And a band of 7 ex-Confederate soldiers came and actually murdered his parents for their stance of being anti-slavery, essentially. And he had a family friend that put a old man's curse on him, the guy by the name of Moses Beeman. He gave him a couple pistols, said, you need to learn how to shoot. And then he went to a local army fort, got really good at shooting, and got the nickname of Pistol Pete. And then over the course of his life was actually a deputy U.S. Marshal, was an Indian fighter, all these things. And under the hanging judge, Isaac Parker, when Oklahoma was still a territory, actually was able to take justice on his parents' behalf and actually end up killing 6 out of the 7 men, to which the last one got caught cheating in a poker game the night before. Frank was going to confront him and got killed. And so then Frank went to the guy's funeral to ensure that he in fact was dead. And then the old man's curse was lifted. So that's like how the lore of Frank Eaton came along. And then Oklahoma State in 1923 was the Tigers. So you're from Princeton.
Yeah.
We were known as the Princeton of the Prairie. So we were the Oklahoma State Tigers. That's where we're orange and black.
That's why my kids were very happy when I came here, because they said, oh, we can keep rooting for the orange and black team.
Yeah, amen. But yeah, as the Princeton of the Prairie. And if you look at it, just geographically, how many Tigers do you know in the United States as a mascot for a Division I university, right? You can look Missouri, Auburn, right, on down the line. So just in the SEC, there's 2 Tigers, right, which is just crazy. And so, actually, 3, LSU. And that all dealt with like Confederacy, right? So the Confederate division out of Missouri were the Tigers, the Fighting Tigers. Okay. So like all like put in together, right? So, but we wanted something more Oklahoman. We were just a newly established state. What is something? And so in 1923, they saw Frank Eaton leading an Armistice Day parade. So they were celebrating a parade ending the end of World War I. And he was leading the parade, and they were like, wow, that's a real-looking Oklahoma cowboy. And from 1923 to when he died in 1958 at 98 years old, he was the walking embodiment, live mascot of Oklahoma State University. And my pitch, so I actually tried out 3 times. And my pitch, whenever I went to go be Pistol Pete on my last attempt, because I was going to graduate, was Frank Eaton died April 8th, 1958, and I was born on April 8th, 86, and then I would be Pistol Pete on the 50th anniversary of Pistol Pete in its form now. So I was like, this is fate. You can't get past this. Let's go. And it all seemed to work out in its favor. So
I was going to ask you if they made you learn the history of Pistol Pete, but they clearly did.
I have not recited that in probably a decade.
But that's impressive that A, you still remember, and B, makes me, I've always had mixed feelings on our mascot, right? It's about shooting off guns, and there's various thoughts about that with someone with young kids. But this makes me feel much better, actually, about the mascot, knowing the history of the person behind it.
Well, and actually, whenever I was in school, they were still live firearms, so I actually had a .357 Magnum that had police-grade blanks. They've since changed the firearms, so they aren't actual weapons anymore, so if that makes you feel any better. But it actually does, I think, correlate to something that's really deep-rooted about self-assurance, love for family, all those other things, which is, I think, the actual real embodiment of who Frank Eden was.
Well, that was great to learn, and as I said, I feel much better about our mascot now.
Yeah.
So you become Pistol Pete, you spend an extra year here,
Yep.
and then you graduate from the OSU, from the history department, and you got a job doing something unrelated to history. Could you tell us what it was?
Yeah. So my last semester, since I was getting I could qualify for my second major in econ. I took a class called Economics of Healthcare and Social Security. And I had this whole thought preemptively going into it, which I think is also a cool thing about history. There's so many times I've changed my perspective looking at researching something because I'm open-minded. I just want to find the truth. And I went into this trying to figure out a way to solve Social Security because, people own the government, right, or whatever the mindset was at that time. And then come to find out the actual bigger waste and the bigger problem for the U.S. economy is healthcare. And so I actually read this book by David Cutler. It's called Your Money, Your Life. And it talked about leveraging technology into bending the cost curve, because the way that the U.S. Constitution is actually set up is that everything is the 10th Amendment says everything that is not relegated by everything that is not stated intently by the Constitution of the federal government is relegated to the states, which is why you see all these health responses that are so disparate, because each state has their own health policies. Also, when it comes to health insurance, that's why you have Blue Cross and Blue Shield across every single state, which then economically breaks up your risk stratification. But the way to solve for that typically is through technology, elimination of toll booths, friction in the system, and technology has a good place to do that. And so I had just got done reading this book, and it was at a career fair at Gallagher-Iba and a company called Cerner Corporation. So Neil Patterson, who's an alumnus of Oklahoma State. His name is on the Pike House and is also on the girls' soccer stadium. Okay. Founded this company called Cerner Corporation. So at the time was the world's largest electronic health records company based out of Kansas City. And I got based on my conversation on this book, I was happened to be very tuned in to the discussion based on what I was learning in class, and got a job straight out of school, essentially as a business. They called it a business consultant role. Long story short, guys, that's the very horrible way of them being able to put you into a desk support role because you're going to be a business consultant. But I ended up getting put in a role where I actually learned medical billing, technology, and all this other stuff for the first 18 months straight out of school. But yeah, electronic health records from a history degree. So
I guess the question is, sounds like maybe you sat in a cubicle for part of this, but what was the first job like, and were there any history kind of skills that you had picked up that maybe applied in terms of your thinking?
The ability to teach yourself, right? I mean, medical billing is hard, right? So I think anybody who's ever wanted to do anything in medical, you have to start early in your career. It's not something you could be 5-10 years in your career and go back and do, because the entry level to that is very dense. And it doesn't pay a lot. And so those jobs of understanding the business, because it's not like you could probably be in finance for any type of organization with the exception of healthcare, because healthcare finance works differently. The way that you actually bill for stuff, like literally most people don't know that insurance companies get billed for $1, but they only pay out 30 cents. So you have to learn how to build a business on 30 cents on the dollar, right, of collection rates. And so it's like all of these things. But I think it was my ability to teach myself, because learning how to manage technology, which was different than anything I had done before, support, which that was easy because I'm pretty personable, but then learning and being competent of not only how to give someone advice on why their software wasn't working, but then also not being in a position of telling them how to do their job, because legally you can't do those things, right? You can't tell them how to bill or what to bill. You can just say, oh, by the way, if this is not working in your system, here's where you screwed up, and then this is what you need to go correct. And so being able to learn that, and that first 18 months was, I'd say the first 12 months was absolutely brutal. The last 6 months I was really good at it, but it just definitely wasn't what I wanted to do. But then from that, started to really find my strengths and was actually asked to go into an executive training program based on the fact that I pushed them more leads for sales than anybody, just based off of helping people. Really found my tenor and tone of my core competency of being consultative, being willing to work with someone and taking the time to find the root of the problem, and then being able to position it for this I guess aspect for the good of the company, which is a key attribute for consultative selling and those sorts of things. So I was bringing all these opportunities to them that from people that were angry, right, calling in and angry. So
makes sense. So we'll skip a bit through your career. You work now at the Butterfly Network.
Yeah.
What is that, first of all?
Yeah. So well, I guess a little bit of. I can jump through a few things, but essentially from medical records, I'll take a step back because it all kind of makes sense. So from my desk job, I actually got placed in the rural health division at Cerner. So I actually ended up selling electronic health records for rural and community hospitals across the whole U.S. And so had kind of an affinity. So fast forward to where Butterfly was. So Butterfly is the world's largest handheld ultrasound company. The reason why we're able to be so proliferated is we are the world's only digital ultrasound. So traditionally, in medical technology, if you want to produce an ultrasound, you would have to take a crystal, it's a lead-based crystal, and then they run electricity through it, and then based on the shape of the device or the probe, creates different sound waves. So that's why if you've ever got an ultrasound, you see a big cart and it has all these different things to use. What Butterfly did that was novel is we created a microchip that has 9,000 little drums on it. And then literally you plug it into your iPhone, say cardiac, and the beam goes really tight, like for a cardiac array. And then if you say abdomen, it goes whoosh, and blows out for an abdomen array. Why this is important is if you look at the world, 25% of the world doesn't have access to any imaging medically. And if you look at these deserts, rural healthcare in America qualifies about 20% of all healthcare delivered. They have very similar limitations. And so access to ultrasound and imaging in rural healthcare is non-existent. And there's this big movement right now in the United States called point-of-care ultrasound. So it's instead of using stethoscopes, it's doctors literally at the bedside. And all medical schools are training on this now. Butterfly is actually the leading ultrasound solution on training with devices. We've actually had several schools lately. All medical students are getting a Butterfly with their white coats now. I mean, it literally is a trend that's coming along. Oklahoma State actually just got a shout out to the College of Medicine, just got an order today for upgrading 20 of their devices. Like, they're investing in it. I mean, really, it's getting to be a big deal. But based on my history with Cerner and rural health, they wanted me to come in and set up a rural health division because, again, the impact of access to anyone at the point of care, literally 80% of diagnostic dilemmas. So if a doctor is like, is it this or that, 80% of them can be solved by just applying ultrasound. And then when it does get applied, half of the time the diagnosis or the care pathway itself changes. So anyway, so that's Butterfly as a whole is kind of what we do.
Yeah. What seems interesting to me, right? I'm not in the healthcare field, but what you just did remarkably well reflects on something we said at the beginning when we were talking about you as a history major, which is the ability to tell stories.
Yeah.
I mean, you just told me a wonderful story about something I knew nothing about, and now I'm like, yeah, let's get that for everyone. So did you find that storytelling is very important to your job?
Well, I'm in sales. So I run the U.S. business for Butterfly. But yeah, I think it does on several levels. One, it's be able to articulate a vision to get people excited to a future state. I mean, that's what selling is, right? It's literally creating a future state and compelling someone to move towards that future state. That's it. I mean, now it's being able to tell a story that is viable, that is understandable, that is tangible with facts and figures, and being able to incorporate all that in, by all means. So I think that's a big component to it. And being able to put together proposals that are logical and that are substantiated, that have citations. I mean, I'm in a medical device, so we still have to cite all this stuff. It's different citations than in history.
Yeah.
But like, fortunately, that's what our marketing department is for. They do all the FDA approval citations, and I'm kind of like, I need to tell this story, go find that. But we do have to have ensuring that we're having appropriate citations and that we're not making claims incorrectly and those sorts of things because of regulation. So.
Yeah, so I mean, that brings me, I guess, to another question I have, which maybe you can reflect upon. I mean, we often encounter in the world, and maybe you did when you were younger, that history majors, right, you go be a social studies teacher in high school, maybe you go work in an archive, maybe you go work in a museum. All these are fantastic jobs. But you've just described for me what sounds to me what I do when I write a book. Obviously in a different format, a different form, but you're collecting facts, you're putting it together in a coherent narrative. So I wonder, do you have a thought on this kind of disconnect that we have as an American society? I'll just speak for America for right now, in terms of this disconnect, right? That you were a brilliant history major and went on to do something that sounds to me like history just in the present.
A 3.0 history major. Let's call a spade for a second. I had a B average. But I have gone on and done got my master. I got a 3.8 in my MBA, so I'm at least not a horrible student. But no, I think I think you're right. I think it literally is almost, there's like a servant's heart to that comes with having a degree in history or even a love or an interest, because all you're wanting to do is just educate people on that, right? And I think it's being able to kind of, I always jokingly say it's just preaching the gospel, right? It's just literally whatever your frame of reference is. I'm always telling somebody something because I find it interesting. I learn way too much about it. I'm a maven for a lot of stuff, but I also have the tools because of my degree to be able to actually know how to deep dive, form my own perspective on something, and then be able to articulate it on the back end. So I think it's applicable across the board, whether it's sales, whether it's consulting, whether it's teaching. Those are all things. And I actually just gave a big presentation about selling to an enterprise. So selling in healthcare, and specifically in what we do, is actually what we consider an enterprise sale. So it's multi-stakeholder, multiple opinions. Each stakeholder has their own role, have their own influence level, and then ultimately there's a financial buyer that you have to create a coalition around. You have to educate all of those people is your job. It's not about selling. It's not about hawking a device. It literally is about educating. And I was at a conference about 2 weeks ago with a series of chief medical officers and chief nursing officers of major health systems across the United States. And while they knew what ultrasound was and how to use it, when I started talking about point of care ultrasound, how it's a trend, how it's actually financially viable, and also how it's currently being done in their institution, whether they've mandated or not, they were like, what do you mean? And this is a guy, again, with a history degree from Oklahoma State, talking to a physician, letting them know that he has a problem in his world in a very articulate and vibrant way, that they understood it, that it wasn't alarming, that it was literally very factual based, to where we actually have processes. But literally, I was confident in doing it because all I was doing was just, hey, I just want to let you know that this is what's going on. Here's what this is. And so it's really that tenor and tone that I think makes, frankly, good citizens as well. So,
can I ask one maybe deeply unfair question for you to reflect upon in terms of...
Deeply unfair, okay.
Well, depends how you think of it. I always think that there's an unfair question that you can ask, but I use it to push people. So how would you, if you were out in the world, sell a history degree as doing all these amazing things and all this amazing training that you've thought about? You know, if we want to go out in the world and say, you should be a history major because actually you can go do all these amazing things like work for the Butterfly Network and save lives and do all these things.
Yeah, no. So I guess the question is more like, how would I promote it? It's a self-serving question. You want me to do your work for you? Okay.
You're the sales guy.
I'm the sales guy.
You should do the work.
No, so I think what it is, I think it's focusing on the why, right? What it is the core competency and the skill sets. If you want to be this type of a person, right? If you believe yourself to be this type of a person and would like the skills to be able to do, to form your own facts, to actually being able to correlate ideas, to be able to better articulate and express yourself, to know your place in the world, to be a good citizen, right? All of those things, to understand your perspective in the world. I mean, frankly, I think my demeanor has always been one of energy, but I'm not one to get upset generally, but I think that was probably reinforced as well, being the fact that, like, it's just looking it up. Like just taking a step back, like looking at the Holocaust, that's atrocious. But like Germany doesn't shy away from it. They actually take the time to actually teach, so they actually learn and they normalize at least the thought process around it, that it's okay to talk about. You shouldn't hide your past. It's opportunity to learn from. Mm-hmm. And so whenever I look at situations, it's like, what can we learn from this? Right? Not, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing, let's not ever talk about it. And I think it's almost instilled in me this consistency, frankly, of failing forward. And it's okay. Like literally I tell my people, I'm like, you should share your failures, resources, and successes, and in that order. Because by sharing your failures, you're actually going to learn more, you're going to grow more. And also it's a see one, do one, teach one. And so really pushing my salespeople to be teachers, right? And so it doesn't matter what you're teaching. It's your impact on your world. And if you want to teach history as how you want to make your impact, great. But I don't think it's limited to that by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sell it. So I think
I'll get on ChatGPT and I'll figure out some ways of boiling that down into some marketing points for you.
Some marketing points, and then we'll distribute it. Yeah.
Yeah, distribute.
Maybe we'll do it with the butterflies things. You get a butterfly, you also get you should be a history major.
Yeah, exactly, right? Something along those lines. Well, and it's funny that you said that about butterflies. So one of the stories that I do like to tell, and maybe it's out of place, but you know, we've been working a lot lately on, to the layperson, how do you talk about the differentiation of digital ultrasound versus analog? Mm-hmm. And literally we've come to really this conclusion that if you look at the digital camera industry and what happened with Kodak and how they were the first to invent it, but they didn't make proper investments because they were relying on their core business of film, and that's how they were going to make it. But if you look at the actual film sales over time, and then the eventual destruction of the camera industry because of the sensors being able to be refined, miniaturized, and now in your phone, it's a really interesting correlation to what we're doing today. Literally, we're in that same pathway where if as soon as it hit 3 megapixels, well, digital cameras were comparable to film, and then they were even easier to use, right? Like portrait mode, I couldn't get if you gave me a film camera, I couldn't make as good of a picture, right? So it's now better image quality, but as soon as analog becomes comparable to digital, digital always wins. And so that's some of the things that we think about, but you have to do a lot of research as to understanding what was the inflection point, what was the actual, you know, because if I didn't say 3 megapixel, maybe that didn't carry as much water. So it's being able to find those facts and figures to be able to tell that allegory into your current world.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I should say that one always hits home. My wife is from Rochester, New York, so this is where Kodak was, right? And so the town radically shifted over the course of her life because of this exact reason.
And do you want to know something even funnier? So Butterfly's largest deployment and the single largest butterfly and ultrasound deployment in the world is actually at the University of Rochester Medical Center. So they have over 1,800 devices across all of their physicians that are digitally using it across the way. And it's the first example of doing something like that in the entire world. And it's literally 3 miles away from the Kodak factory. So
to continue this, and then we'll put a pin in it. This is because the U of R became the main driver of the economy, and they've remade themselves in a whole bunch of ways that Rochester's actually now, again, a wonderful place to live and raise a family because of industries coming in. So it's good to know.
Yeah.
So I want to shift now to kind of other things you've done in life, and your career is not only your life, as far as I'm aware. Again, we met at the Touch a Truck event. Which is fun, I think.
It wasn't, and to be clear, it wasn't just two men going to a touch truck. I want to be very clear on that. It was, so my middle son, Everett, and Myrtle's kids were in kindergarten together. So our wives met, and then it was a whole clan event.
Yeah, it was a clan. So that's a fair way to put it. I was trying to express the fact that it's just a bunch of kids slamming on the horns of these trucks.
Yeah, you have
nonstop.
You have electric trucks, you have bulldozers, you have police cars and fire trucks and dump trucks, and it's a lot of fun.
So some of your work outside of your career is about some advocacy work.
Yeah.
And you've worked on drafting, lobbying, and passing actually a healthcare law. So maybe first you can tell us what the law is and why you did it.
Yeah, so taking a step back, so my middle son, Everett, so I have 3 wonderful children. I feel like Everett gets the spotlight a lot, but I have three wonderful kids. Everett's my middle, but he had a birth diagnosis of Down syndrome and a congenital heart defect that had to be surgically repaired at a year. And so when we were preparing for his heart surgery, we were in St. Louis at the time, St. Louis Children's, and they were like, well, thank goodness you're in St. Louis because Missouri has protections if he needs a heart transplant. And we were like, what do you mean it has protections? And again, to my point about different laws on different states, as well as federal protections in federal courts, health law is not really good for federal courts because if someone has a dispute, it takes years to get through federal court.
Yep. So
these need to be settled on a state-by-state basis. And come to find out, as we're sitting there through, waiting for my son's heart surgery, we're like, what is this guy even talking about? Came to find out, my wife's from from Illinois, I'm from Oklahoma, and Missouri had a law in the book that actually was an anti-discrimination law, not allowing for disability to be a factor in an organ transplant process. So because a doctor, and for those that don't know about organ transplants, if you are up, so everybody gets on a list, but then it's actually the surgeon that provides the transplant that makes the final decision as to if you have two candidates that are like for like, who is actually getting is getting it based on a whole bunch of different factors. Well, there was no restriction that they couldn't say, well, Merle, you have Down syndrome, Rhys, you don't. Rhys gets it even though you've been on the waiting list longer. There was also a couple other loopholes that once a child turns 18, their parent couldn't accept an anatomical gift on their behalf. So even if I was Everett's caregiver for the rest of his life, they could make the claim that he wasn't of sound body and mind because of him having Down syndrome, and thus he couldn't agree to getting a new liver because part of that is I'll never drink alcohol again, right? All those different factors. And so then they could bypass him for a different reason. And so my wife and I, as we're reading through this, decided that if we ever moved to Oklahoma or Illinois, we would do something about it. And so we moved in May of 2020. Just so happened, former OSU alumnus and the congresswoman for District 5 out of Oklahoma, Stephanie Bice, had just gotten elected, was leaving the Oklahoma State Senate, and just happened to be my mom's next door neighbor. And so when I was just talking with her, and I was just like, hey, this is something I think we want to do. She was like, well, give me more information about it. And so we actually called a friend of ours who did something similar, passed a similar law, because my wife is really connected both through, they call it Partners in Policymaking here in Oklahoma. She actually runs some Heart Heroes groups for individuals with Down syndrome through Facebook. We both have done stuff through the Down Syndrome Diagnosis Network. So I ran the DADS group for a number of years, which is a national organization. And actually we're going to D.C. in a few weeks to go lobby Congress on Down syndrome policy. But I also go on tangents.
As every good historian does.
Yeah, for sure. But what happened was we called this guy in Louisiana, and he gave his draft bill. We basically sat down. This was pre-ChatGPT, so I had to go through and actually rewrite it to fit Oklahoma, and then we submitted it to a gentleman named Paul Racino. He's a state senator, now runs the Health and Human Services Committee for the Oklahoma State Senate. He accepted it, ran the bill. I got to go up there and do a whole bunch of politic and handshake and taking Everett around, introducing him to a bunch of lawmakers. But it passed unanimously in the House, the Senate first, and then the House, and then was signed into law by Governor Stitt in 2020, April of 2020. But we actually ended up naming it after our son, so Everett's Law. So,
cool.
Which was really special, and it's also wonderful to think that my son is codified in the Oklahoma State Constitution.
Yeah,
so
that's very cool.
So
it sounds like, if I can return us to the history angle for a second,
yeah.
There was probably a lot of research and putting together a story as well.
And also understanding government, right? Because you always send those government classes, but actually running a bill with no experience, you have to really understand what you're doing, how to do it, because it's not just, it goes to the House and then to the Senate. I make it sound simple. There's committee. You have to prepare for testimony. So as a parent, I had to testify. There's all these different aspects to it that it has to first get accepted by a lawmaker. Then it has to go to committee. Then after it passes committee, it then has to be seen if it actually messes with the budget, because that's another committee it would have to go through. And if it doesn't mess with that, then it goes to the Senate for a vote. Then it goes to the House, goes through that whole process again, then reconciles the bill, and then it is ready to be signed once it's been agreed upon and rectified. So like there's all this other stuff of how to actually do that and a lot of tactics. And you also have to do a lot of writing. So you actually have to come in with flyers to be able to drop off at your legislator. You have to know how to politic, who to investigate as to what, because again, you just need a simple majority to get this stuff out of committee and there. So you literally have to do research on who these people are, who do you think are positives, who are negatives. Fortunately, having a child with a disability for something that is a no-brainer, that everybody in Oklahoma is pro-life. Well, this is the most ultimate pro-life bill.
For sure.
Right? Ensuring that everybody has equal access to getting their life safe seems like a pretty no-brainer. And it was, right? But you find it funny, and I say that in jest, that it passed unanimously, but there's been states that it's been taking years for them to get the same legislation pushed through. Okay. So but it was all preparation around writing and not sounding like a fool when you write these things out, because a lot of times you don't get to meet with those people, and all they know is the flyer that you have.
Is the little bit that you give them. So putting together the research and the story and the marketing and the approach is all absolutely.
And it's funny because then the 6 months after that, I started my MBA after we got this passed, and I got a certificate in health administration, one of which those classes was healthcare policy and politics, of which was at the state capitol by and the professor was a former chief of staff for Oklahoma Department of Health. And the whole thing was like, how do you write a bill? How do you actually pass legislation and all that sort of stuff? So I actually got to learn it academically after the fact. After I did it. So
did you do a good job, or did you make a mess of it?
No, I actually turned in most of my stuff that I used to really pass the law and didn't change it, because I was like, this worked. Why would I do that? And wasn't to the format of what you're supposed to do. So I still got an A in the class, let's be clear. But it was definitely, I didn't do it. I guess I didn't do it the right way. It was effective, though.
Is there any other kind of advocacy work you've done more recently where some of these skills have come in useful?
Actually defended the there was a Senate law that was actually proposed, or a law that came out of the Senate a few weeks back, that was going to be restricting PT, OT, and speech services across the entire state of Oklahoma. So basically not allowing students to receive PT, OT, and speech services because it was a waste, that it was Health and Human Services. It shouldn't be in there. I, again, did a lot of research as to what this was. Granted, I'm already pretty understanding of health law, know a lot about the education system through IDEA, and the protections that people have in place today, why it's important. I mean, frankly, I was on an IEP. I actually have a writing disability. There's my fun fact for the day. And so I have a history degree with a writing disability. But it was but it wasn't that I couldn't do it. It's just I needed to figure out my way of doing it, right?
Absolutely.
So it's not the fact that I actually had a full disability. It was literally I had a different way of doing it, that I needed additional resources to get there. And so that would have stripped that out of the Oklahoma education system. And so I did some research, real research, not just Googling stuff, but like really sat down, looked at all this stuff, and just really wrote a heartfelt, compassionate post that was very, I think, fatherly, but loving of this great state, loving of my child, but also believing as a society we can do better, and we've proven in the past that we can do better. And it was crazy. I wrote it in like 45 minutes on a Sunday, and by Wednesday, it had 11,000 shares across the world. I think they estimated somewhere around like 15 million views. I had 3 news stories done where I was interviewed for the news, and the bill was withdrawn within 36 hours. So, but again, it was because I could articulate based on actual research, being convincing and understanding that position. So,
yeah. Well, I found it convincing, so I called my state senator multiple times the next day.
Yeah, well, and to that, Adam Pugh is both of our senator, and he's a good man. He actually sits on the Health and Human Services.
I know, that's why I thought this was the perfect person.
Committee, and he's also the chairman of the education committee. So Adam's a wonderful guy. Actually, I've got to meet him several times, but we actually spent a flight together from Atlanta, Georgia. Just happened to be sitting next to each other and got to catch up a while back, and Anyways, digressing. But you know, I think what it's also done is those skills have put me in a position to advocate for my family. I think position our state for a better future, and you know, be able to convince others of the same. And so, because there's also reasons why those protections are in place, and if you understand. Mm-hmm. You know, and this is not meant to be any sort of broader statement to this, but like when people talk about making America great again, you have to get rid of the 60s if you want to go back to the 50s. And there's a reason why the protections were put in place in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so it's ensuring that you find that right balance, that those individuals are protected, that those safeguards are in place, regardless of your ability to think about, you know, a lot of those other hot button buzzwords. It's really, why are they actually there in place today, and why are they relevant and important? Because frankly, looking forward now, the next fight, I was interviewed last week on a big press conference around the dissolution of the Department of Education. Well, that has huge ramifications to me and my family and my child, right? And so, but why was it established in the first place? What was the problems that we're serving, right? It might not be perfect today, but that's the beauty of our democracy is, and our way of law is, it's a progressively better and better place. It's never going to happen all at once, but there's a reason that those constructs were built. And if something's overly built, then you deconstruct it and you rebuild it, but you just don't throw away the baby with the bathwater. And I think it's those lessons of why that works and why it's worked for 250 years also makes me not, emotional when I talk about it. I can be very factual when you talk about things because, well, where are you coming from? We're trying to understand other humans. And I think one thing, now that I'm a father, that I did not expect out of a history degree is the empathy, that the skills that you learn from a history degree give you to be able to actually, again, be a good citizen writ large. Because when people make claims and comments, I know how I can go figure out where they're false, where they're true, where they're half-truths, and all those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So in this world of disinformation, it actually is just a key to be a good human and a good citizen, know how to say something appropriately, to say it factually, to not say it emotionally, because those are all things you're teaching right now in your classes. Because again, it's about telling it how it is, not how you're trying to frame it. And emotion's the worst thing you can have for interpersonal communications, relationships, as well as business. So to me, I think that's as apolitical as I can get by really talking about policy and the way forward. Like, how do you want to be as a human, right? Yeah. And I think you can articulate that very well in the skills that a history degree teach you up for long-term success.
So now that we're getting toward the end, we always ask our guests 2 questions.
Oh, gosh.
So hopefully they're fair questions. I think they're fair questions.
I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and they asked me what my favorite barbecue was. So hopefully it's in
No. It's nothing like that. Okay. I don't actually have my own answer to that question. Maybe I'll have to ask you after we stop recording.
Living in Kansas City, I'm very particular.
That's fair.
Yeah.
So these days, in the 21st century, history and humanities, and we've talked about this a bit, are struggling to demonstrate our direct relevance. But I think you've given us a lot of examples. But we're told, for example, that history is a bad career move, right? If you major in history, you won't get a job. And I think you've disproven that point at least. But what's strange about that is there's also a disconnect, right? So the more people say that, the more people actually watch and consume history content, right? You just watch Netflix or any documentary, Gladiator 2, if you saw that last year. I have many thoughts on that. We can talk about that at some other point. So everyone loves history.
Denzel was great. Denzel was great.
Yep, that's true. I'll leave it at that. Uh-huh. But I guess what I'm trying to get to is people love the history in the popular world, but have this kind of very negative perspective on it in terms of the academic world. So what do you see as or what do you make, I guess I should say, of this apparent paradox between history having trouble within the university, but then probably being the most loved I've ever seen, just in the broader American world?
Well, that's their version of history. I think that's the context to it, and I think that's what I was articulating to is people have now been able to insulate themselves to their point of view, and they don't want to be challenged on said point of view. So if you talk about true academic history, it's very factual. It's very, you have to prove it out. It's a very scientific method. I mean, it's a social science. Let's call it that, right? So that is the intrinsic problem is if someone has an opposing view that they don't quite understand or doesn't understand nuance. I think that's the other thing from a history degree that allows for you to be a good human and a good business person. You can understand nuance, and there are shades of gray in everything, and right now everything is so freaking black and white if we're looking at the world. And so to me, I think it's all about framing. Everything is about how you frame it and your perspective. So if a student doesn't think that they're going to get a job because of a history degree, or someone won't hire someone because of a history degree, well, that's not that's because they don't understand what that actually means, and that's up to that candidate for that job to articulate. Because of yes, I have a history degree, but I also have these classes, I have these skills, but this is actually going to differentiate me as a critical thinker, as all of those things, and being able to articulate that in the header of your resume or in your letter as to why you want to be there. I have these skills that are unlike anybody else to be able to position it in such a way. So no, I don't buy that in the slightest. I think it's all about what you want to do and what fills your cup. One thing I learned from Everett though is how do I word this? The way that he doesn't let the small stuff get him, but he appreciates the little things, right? And so to me, it's about finding your purpose in this world, what fills your cup. And so teaching might not, like academically teach, like me teaching a whole bunch of high schoolers, came to find out that's not what I wanted to do to fill my cup, but the active love of being able to grow others was. So I found my path that way, but it's rooted and founded in my love of finding truth, of finding real perspective and being able to validate things myself. And that's really the core competency skills of a history degree that I think gets lost. And so that's where employers and society writ large needs to focus. But I guess that answers both of your bad rap question as well as how to position it if you're not wanting, you love the idea of a history degree, but you also want to be able to do something different.
Yeah. So I have one last question, which is kind of a spin on that, we might say, which is the party question, right? So you may go to gatherings of one sort or another, and people probably talk about you going to OSU, and they say, what did you major in? Right? This happens. We have all of these conversations.
Yeah.
And they might ask questions about history. Oh, you're a history major. What do you like to study? So if you had to decide, what would be the question you wish someone would ask you about, history or a history degree?
That I wish they would ask me. So I can first go through what they do ask me. So like literally last night, I had a phone call with a friend of mine. He's running for Edmond School Board, and we were talking about some stuff. And then he was like, oh, you're going to go do this history. I don't know you have a history degree. I got 2 questions for you. And it's usually something, what's your favorite war? Which I don't know why it always has to be a war. And then this one was interesting. Has there ever been an administration that has just disregarded the standards of rule of law and those sorts of things? And so it's really interesting. People will come up with some stuff like all of a sudden, like I know every single historical relevance of every single president that is out there, right? Like, no, I mean, can I name probably 3/4 of them at this point in my life? Maybe, right? Don't give I got like 5 vice presidents, right? But it's just funny. People just assume that you know every little detail about every little facet of everything that's ever happened in the country, right? So, but questions that I would want to be asked, oh shoot, I don't know. I think maybe, I really like this. Like, what is that actually meant for you in career, or how did you get from a history degree to where you are today? Because usually when I'm in healthcare, I like for them to know that I'm not clinical, yet I'm going toe-to-toe with them. Why? Because I actually am proud of my degree from Oklahoma State, and I think to your point, it kind of gets a bad rap. So maybe it's probably the discussion we're having today, that it is how do you do what you do? How did you get there? Why is that relevant and important? And I think, and that's a lot more personal of an answer than, what's your favorite war? I think that one's. I don't know how often you get that, but that one's pretty good. Or it's what kind of history? What kind of history are we talking about here? European, American history. I don't know. So.
I like the accent there. That was a good way to.
Yeah, so that's my not anybody who's not a history major. That's how they speak, right? No, I'm kidding. Can we edit that out?
Thank you, Rhys, for coming on, and thank you for exploring good history with us. And thanks to the Good History team, my colleagues, Dr. Sarah Griswold and Dr. Brian Hosmer, Christina Rogers, a PhD candidate in our department as well. And remember, the only bad history is history we don't know.